So we just talked about the history of Sword and Sorcery. We talked about the films. We talked about the TV shows. We've talked about the TTRPGs. This week, we're diving into Sword and Sorcery, how it's different from epic fantasy, and a little bit more in-depth about the subgenre.
Welcome to another episode of We Aren't Dead Yet. I'm Emily Armstrong, creator of the TTRPG system Quests and Quarrels, as well as the settings Becketville, Culinary Punk, and Elder Space.
Hello, I am Daz and Cat. I am the creator of the TTRPG Meaty Bones, as well as the worlds of Pangorio and Hypnosium.
Hi there, my name is Sapha Burnell. I'm a best-selling cyberpunk and mythpunk author and an editor for a small press, and I'm going to remind everybody today there's always something we can do, because we aren't dead yet.
Fantastic literature points to or suggests the basis upon which cultural order rests, for it opens up, for a brief moment, onto disorder, onto illegality, onto that which is outside dominant value systems. The fantastic traces the unsaid and the unseen of culture, that which has been silenced, made invisible, covered over, and made absent. Rosemary Jackson.
Epic fantasy lives in this space of sweeping narratives on grandiose stakes, formed from the bedrock of the Eurocentric canon of the epic poetry found in Gilgamesh, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneas, and then later works like Beowulf or the Kalevala, and the chivalric tales of Western Europe. There's usually a separation of man and gods, aspirational heroes, ancient monsters, and settlements as safe havens, similar to the Norse mythological view of the Utengard and Innengard. So basically, the Utengard is everything outside of your encampment, and that is the place of chaos, the place of monsters, the place of, murder and those things that go bump in the dark. But in the Innengard, in the inside guarded place, that is the place where order and the rule of law and society can actually flourish. So that does make a huge bit of difference when it comes to something like epic fantasy. You could see this in Lord of the Rings with the Shire and how that tiny little contained space is very civilized, it's very orderly, and it just functions on its own kind of functional way. You see that with the Rohirrim, and you also see that with Gondor. So you have this like wild outer place, and yet once you get into a city, you're supposed to find, the order of civilization. You're supposed to find the laws of society and this sense of kind of chivalry owned. And in some places that goes a little bit wrong, like you see in Lord of the Rings with Gondor, but then it is revived by the end of the series, and you are still substantiating the traditional view of that sense of settlement as a safe haven, that settlement, that encampment, that city, that town as a safe place. This is incredibly different from Sword and Sorcery. There is a moral ambiguity and sense of cultural corruption in a lot of Sword and Sorcery, especially when it comes to city-states and ruling classes and things like that. The idea that moral deterioration of humankind stems from cultural development created a sense that those never exposed to culture had a natural morality. This is where the ambiguity of Sword and Sorcery heroes, usually associated with self-centered liberation and natural justice, finds its core. We see this especially with the works of Robert E. Howard and how he patterned Conan after this lost portion of Texas, which had yet, was just starting to be sort of quote unquote civilized, and how that brought in a lot of things that he perceived as moral deterioration.
Their ambitions are usually selfish and modest, in consequence of which their achievements are rarely as prodigious as those of the messianic heroes of epic fantasy. Stableford, 2009.
Epic fantasy promises resolution, the satisfaction of the problem solved or the quest completed, and a sense of affirmation. And now that is partially a quote from Ria Shane, who wrote at the University of Liverpool. The day is usually saved, or geopolitical issues resolved for a time. The quest comes to an end, and even unlikely heroes like hobbits find their courage and their mettle proved by the end to have the warrior's archetype usual promise of a quiet and dignified life waiting for them. This is epic fantasy. This is what it's for. It is meant to go forward through the chaos and eventually find a sense of not necessarily traditional welcome at the end, but to find a sense of completion, to find a sense that it's going to be okay. The main difference between epic fantasy and sword and sorcery heroes is the attempt to portray protagonists as those who rise above the injustice and dangers of their circumstances to save the world or rectify the quest, and thus have earned the ability to go home and live quietly, where in sword and sorcery, the usually masculine protagonist goes from battle to battle in a violent and unseemly world, setting some things into balance, but having few long-term lofty goals beyond the self. So there's that sense of scale difference where epic fantasy is usually epic. It's usually something that will shake the world, shake the civilization, shake society, where it's a lot less big in sword and sorcery, while also lacking that sense of moral high ground.
Balthus emerged dubiously and stared at the stranger. He felt curiously helpless and futile as he gazed on the proportions of the forest man. He moved with the dangerous ease of a panther. He was too fiercely supple to be a product of civilization, even that fringe of civilization which composed the outer frontiers, Robert E. Howard beyond the Black River. She turned towards Conan, her bosom heaving, her eyes flashing. Fierce fingers of wonder caught at his heart. She was slender, yet formed like a goddess, at once lithe and voluptuous. Her only garment was a broad silken girdle. Her white ivory limbs and the ivory globes of her breasts drove a beat of fierce passion through the Cimmerian's pulse, even in the panting fury of battle. Her rich black hair, black as the Stygian night, fell in rippling, burnished clusters down her supple back. Her dark eyes burned on the Cimmerian. Robert E. Howard, Queen of the Black Coast.
Welcome to Men Writing Women, the original. So what we just heard were two renditions of the way that Robert E. Howard sexualized both males and females within his work. And this is part of the titivation. This is part of the thrill of early sword and sorcery literature, something that was cheaply purchased and that would thrill people who were living fairly traditional, fairly lacking lives in the Great Depression in the United States. And so the majority, but not all, of sword and sorcery works reproduce traditional masculinity and patriarchy, with clearly defined traditionally feminine gender roles for the usual damsel, sometimes warrior women. There's a sense of masculine dynamism, the oiled pecs and long locks of the virile, sword-wielding scrapper with humble beginnings, a la Conan. You know, we've all seen Arnold Schwarzenegger that, you know, had an oil budget to keep his pectoral muscles and shoulders nice and oiled up for the camera and different things like that. You know, that's the sense of this. It is this overt sexualization. It is this overt sensationalization. And we see this too when it drifts into the comics into the 70s, where we eventually get what I'm going to talk about with Red Sonja and how she went from a piece of historical fantasy to what we see of her in different Marvel comics and movies. So traditional masculinity is stoic, competitive, dominant, and aggressive. It discourages empathy, affection, and mutualism. Sword and sorcery comes out of a historical context of asserting traditional roles within a thrilling and fantastical world where those removed from cultural biases are both released from cultural consequence and empowered of a violent and justified brutalism. Women have two modes in most of sword and sorcery history: the masculinized warrior queen, or the ultra-sexual warrior who, upon meeting the masculine hero, takes the subordinate, submissive, sensual role. Think of Belit that we heard about in the quote above. You know, she is this powerful pirate queen who is taken care of by an entire ship full of men who know not to touch her. And then she has one meeting with Conan the Barbarian. They lock eyes in combat. And by the end of it, she takes the immediate submissive sexual role, including the quote, "You have held and crushed and conquered me," that Howard wrote in that same story of Queen of the Black Coast. While women such as Valeria, among others, did have their power, they were often rendered helpless at times and sexually submissive to correspond with the heroic actions of their masculine love. Thus, while they did perform in the traditionally masculine arenas of warfare and piracy, they also, in the end, fulfilled the function of traditional femininity.
Works of sword and sorcery fantasy often have the reputation of reproducing traditional masculinity through figures of heroism that embody a stoic, self-reliant, and self-righteous machismo. They are similarly regarded as presenting stereotypical femininity as emotional, dependent, and delicate. This genre is critically underutilized despite its unique capacity and bountiful potential to channel and redirect cultural expectations of gender roles and social norms. Sword and sorcery texts often reflect the patriarchal structures of reality, but they can also challenge and subvert those same structures. Anthony Conrad Shafalo. While many sword and sorcery tales conform to gender categories, they also have the capacity to shatter stereotypes of the real world. Anthony Conrad Shafalo.
Normally, when we say the words Red Sonja, we think instantly of this bikini babe in a chainmail bikini, which was a representation of Red Sonja in the 1970s by Marvel Comics with Roy Thomas and artist Barry Windsor Smith. This happened decades after Howard's death, and the real Red Sonja that R.E. Howard wrote was Red Sonja of Rogatino in a historical fiction piece. So she was still this Slavic battle axe of a woman who was outsmarting different sultans and fighting in battle and saving the hero of the story. And she was then taken and turned into the Red Sonja that we see and recognize in such things as the comics as a pair for Conan. Red Sonja and characters like Catherine Lucille Moore's Gyrel of Joyery resisted the organized conventions of the time. These heroines are by far the exception, not the rule, and usually include a sense of female masculinity.
That is not to say, however, that the protagonist is never female. Authors like C.L. Moore and Jessica Amanda are some that utilize a female sword wielder. However, these characters are rarely truly characters with actual emotional development or elaborate story arcs. Even when the protagonist is female, they resemble a female version of a male character, rather than being a female character built from the ground up. Troublesome portrayal of women is deeply ingrained in sword and sorcery, frequently drawing inspiration from the many variations of the damsel in distress trope, which removes all agency from female characters. Dino Musiche.
So this, I think, needs to come into when we have characters like Valeria from Conan stories by Howard and others. Yes, Valeria was a powerful, highwayman of her own right. Yes, she was a sword wielder who could battle against men and sometimes succeed, while at the same time, they also portrayed her as held down and naked and being fetishized in various other ways so that Conan had to go and save her. So while they did have these incredibly progressive moments of women fighting and things like that, there still, by the end of the story, was this return to traditionalism, the return to the hero saving the princess, the lady love in the tower, the woman that needs saving. So that's why I'm a little bit less, when it comes to sword and sorcery, about being like, hey, yes, there were subversive female heroes. This is true. But by the end of their stories, generally speaking, they upheld traditional gender roles instead of completely subverting them all the way over. And you see this too with heroines, where really it's exactly the same story steps and motivations as the male heroes. Well, that is a masculinization of a female. That is not necessarily looking at a female's unique, life events and different things like that. So when you're looking at that kind of thing too, you're seeing that most of these people, not all of them, there was C.L. Moore, there was Jessica Amanda, and there were several women who wrote good sword and sorcery works. But when you look at the majority of the canon, especially early on, they were mostly written by men. And so it was one of those places where we see a lot of early men writing women kind of tropes going on there. I just think it's fascinating when you look at Red Sonja, when you see that Marvel Comics took this historical fiction that Howard had written and turned her into a female Conan. And then we have the movie that was made in 1985.
Ah, yes, the movie. I personally like this movie. It did horrible at the box office. And it did have Arnold in it. But it had all new female actresses, which is probably why they wanted to link it so closely to Conan in the beginning. It is still a much-watched movie, and a lot of people in the sword and sorcery genre who will enjoy that always put this on the list. So yeah, this is a good movie to watch. But one of the things you have to take into account is they needed to put Red Sonja in a world, and they connected her to Conan the Barbarian because Conan was big, it was the same crew anyway, and all this other stuff, they were all linked together. But in Red Sonja, they did take it where it was her story. And basically, Conan was just going along to assist. He had no controlling part in it.
Yeah, and I think the thing with Red Sonja, too, it's an interesting motif, and you get a similar one in Gyrello Joyery, but especially in Red Sonja, the way that they did it in 1985, the way they did it in the comics, was basically that she was almost Athena-like. You know, a female character could be there and could be enticing in her appearance and things like that, but she fought really hard up until she was bested in battle by a worthy man, when she can then copulate and she could then actually engage in sexual behaviors. And so Red Sonja, you know, she's basically untouchable until she loses in combat to a worthy man. And then all of a sudden her nature as a woman comes forward and her nature as a warrior is pushed back. I think that's an interesting motif, and one that we see in quite a bit of like literature, you know?
Yeah, and I also, just on masculine traits to begin with, whenever you act in a strong manner, like your boss, whenever you get to be that boss attitude and you're a woman, people are like, look at you because that's assumed to be a masculine trait. So, but at the same time, you need it.
I mean, that's the whole question of formative gender and social gender. And like that is the entire conversation. You know, where are these lines? Is one kind of way of being more masculine presenting than another? Yes. You know, and sometimes you see you push things like different forms of leadership too far, and you can see how a lot of that quote unquote masculine style leadership actually acts as very cutthroat and very damaging and very harsh, whereas more of what's defined as more of a feminine view of leadership is about, you know, taking the team and making sure that all of the team is built up and that everyone can do their jobs together, and taking more of a glance on maybe some more of the social aspects of different things, but also getting into, well, you know what, I'm going to make sure that I know that you're doing okay mentally so you can be here in this space. What do you need? Like, how can we make sure you as a person are taken care of, as opposed to, this is the checklist, get it done, I don't care how you do it. You know, so it's that kind of thing too. I think where it breaks down in leadership is one is more nurturing than the other. If you're in a situation where you have to act quickly, that nurturing, caring attitude might be misplaced. Sometimes you just got to yell orders and get shit done because there's lives on the line, there's other things on the line, things like that. But if you have the chance to slow down, then that other form of leadership can actually be quite effective. So I think it has more to do with that kind of thing too. And what is kind of pronounced as more masculine and pronounced as more feminine, going back to those traditional gender roles, which, I mean, even today we are struggling with as a society, to see whether or not some of these are biological and other ones are just completely socially trained. We still don't know that. We still have no idea about that. We know that there are more masculine traits and more feminine traits based on fMRI research out of Tel Aviv University, you know, thousands upon thousands of fMRI scans to see, you know, where certain things live in the brain and whether or not certain things are gendered. And certain things have been found to be more prevalent in one gender over another, but that doesn't mean that that's always the case. I think personally, I think there is a level of fluidity to it. I think that there are absolutely things about gender and gender performance which are not nature, but nurtured in society. And we do need to take a look at that. And we do need to be honest and open about that. But I do think that, the jury is still out on other things, which might be DNA based, or, are there various other chemicals in the brain that are released in some of the population and not all of the population? Like, I think there's a lot more science that needs to go into it.
Yeah, 100%. Humans as a species are very complicated, to say the least.
Yeah. Very, very.
This has been the Creator Guide, our slightly more academic, more in-depth show based on various genres, subgenres, and ways of forming literature. If there is something that you want us to tackle, whether it is a genre, a subgenre, or a subject matter within science fiction and fantasy or within video games, and you want us to go on a deeper dive and look up the scholarship on that thing, please let us know. Hit us up on Substack. That is wearen'tdeadyet.substack.com. You can also join our Lasting Legends and get behind the scenes information. Our entire reference list and reading list will be made available, and a bunch of our notes in a sort of essay format will be released at a later time so that you can dive into the scholarship. And with that, all you rebels, writers, and gamers, we're wrapping up another mind-bending episode of We Aren't Dead Yet, your go-to for all things TTRPG and speclit. Stay wild, curious, and keep defying the ordinary. Until next time, hit up WADY at vraedamedia.ca/WADY. That's VRAEYDAMEDIA.ca/WADY. Like and subscribe, share with your friends, check out our merch store. We'll see you next week for more news, views, and hullabaloos. So keep the fires burning, the dice rolling, and the pages turning. And remember, there's always something we can do, because we aren't dead yet.